Tonight, the topic we'll be taking a stern look at is climate reporting. I'll be talking with three professional journalists on the climate beat. Alex Kaufman of HuffPost, Dharna Noor of Gizmodo's Earther blog, and Emily Atkin, the founder of the climate newsletter Heated. We'll start with you, Alex. Can you tell me what climate reporting means to you? What does it mean to be a climate journalist?
Well, thank you for having me. What does it mean to be a climate journalist? I mean, that's a big question, particularly in a year like this. I think it is being an interpreter of the existing science that is out there and the latest science. I think it is being an active debunker of the kind of denialism and misinformation and fallacies that have pervaded our political discourse, particularly in the past 2 decades in discussing this. I think it is being a journalist who is willing to question some of the orthodoxies around objectivity that I think led us to the point now where we have had to correct for so many of these mistakes in the way that climate is discussed, and provide our readers with information that they can trust in an ecosystem where there is so much BS.
So would you say that it's primarily a science beat? Are you mostly reporting on new studies about the impact of climate change, or is it broader than that?
I think it's much larger than that, and I think it depends on the place and on the audience that you're writing for. Certainly it was thought of and covered as a science beat for a long time. That is not the way that I have approached it, nor is that the way that I've seen it. I think fundamentally the story of dealing with climate change is an economic story and it's a political story. And that is the approach that I've taken to covering it, although certainly there are many people in this world who do vital and important work, covering just the latest science, covering just the way that it affects certain communities, and covering the ways in which it plays out just on the political and policy level.
So do you think of yourself as someone who is writing about or covering, the quote unquote climate change debate or global warming debate?
Yes, in the sense that I think that there is an active and lively and important debate that's happening right now about how we ought to address this, what the right mix is of different solutions and technologies, and how we should, what kinds of coalitions we should build to bring about those kinds of changes. Now, I think what you're getting at with that question is are we actively covering the debate over whether climate change is happening or not, or whether it is a real problem or not, or whether it's man-made or not? I don't subscribe to that binary as accurate or a clear depiction of what the actual debate around climate change is. I think that there is a well-funded political apparatus that has created that kind of false dichotomy for the past 2 decades. But I don't see my role, nor do I see the role of most good climate reporters as doing that. Although I do think it is very important to cover the actors who propagate, fund, and abuse that misinformation to block serious government action to deal with climate change.
So the idea is not so much to cover the debate over whether or not climate change is happening. These are the people who say it is, these are the people who say it isn't. But at this point, the real debate is over how to deal with it.
I think that's right.
And now let's talk about some of your recent work. I know you published an article today, I believe, looking at New York State's commitment to climate change and the decision to divest from fossil fuel companies.
That's right. That was a big news story that came out this morning. We had some advance notice that it was likely to happen, and sure enough, it did this morning. That after years of refusing to take steps to divest from fossil fuels, the New York State Comptroller announced that they would be doing pretty serious reviews of all of the different fossil fuel holdings, including oil and gas, that the state's massive pension fund, the third largest in the country, and the one of the largest in the world, is invested in.
So is that a climate story? I mean, it feels kind of like a politics story.
It's a politics story. It's a finance story. But that is the realm in which I see some of the most exciting climate stories right now. The phenomenon of what is happening in the atmosphere is always looming in the background, and I think is always necessarily present in any story that you do about these things. But what we do about those emissions in the atmosphere that are trapping heat on the planet is a question of where capital moves around, and it's a question of who is willing to direct that capital in the direction that it needs to go.
And so what is your background as a journalist? How did you get into climate or environmental reporting?
Well, my background as a journalist is fairly standard. I started interning at a small newspaper when I was in high school. I went to college and worked on the Metro desk at the Boston Globe. I then did media reporting, which is how I think you and I, Peter, got to know each other initially, and became a business reporter. And after maybe 5 years or so of covering business, in late 2014, early 2015, I became really interested in a lot of the discussion of sustainability that was happening in the business world, particularly in the lead up to the Paris Climate Summit, which ultimately led to the Paris Agreement. And the deeper that I delved into some of these corporate commitments that were being made by different big companies to decarbonize, the more I asked myself, well, this seems significant. There are people who say it's significant, but how significant is it actually? And the deeper that I dug into that, the less significant it seemed, because the more severe the problem became to me. And so I began covering policy more. I began covering the science more, first to augment that business coverage, and then eventually made that switch completely just before the Trump administration took office. And certainly there's been a lot of work and stories to cover from that administration in the past 4 years.
So let's talk about that idea of covering sustainable businesses. As you said, you initially thought, this is very significant. And then as you did more research and sort of dug into the evidence, you realized maybe it's not as significant as especially business reporters might think it is. So, what is this idea of, businesses being sustainable? Is there a risk of greenwashing that, companies get a lot of press for saying, we are going to use renewable energy, we are going to try and fight the climate crisis, but then they're not actually doing enough, or they're not really making a difference?
You nailed it there, and I think that there's actually a bigger kind of 10,000-foot view to take on this too, which is that when readers are given the idea that individual actions, either in their consumer choices as shoppers, or in the individual decision of a large corporation to transition its headquarters over to solar and wind, I think that gives people the sense that enough individual action can be taken to make a significant difference on global emissions, and that simply isn't true. And I think that there's a real danger to conflating these steps that companies take, or steps that individuals take, with the actual response that we need to have to climate change. And I think that looking at those steps from those companies, particularly today, as anything other than a very thoughtful and prudent business decision, when solar is by far the cheapest electricity that the world has ever seen and will be in the next decade, and when it is so clear that there will be regulations that will demand that they make some types of investments to decarbonize, would be a misrepresentation, I think, of what those companies are actually doing. So I think this has evolved a lot, and I think that the broader understanding that business reporters as well have of this has evolved a lot. But I think that's what motivated me initially.
So in general, you'd say that responsible climate reporters need to, I guess, draw connections between politics and climate, but probably shouldn't draw connections between, the climate crisis and what individual companies, or especially, individual readers or their audience can do, because that's not really where the climate crisis gets solved.
About 50 years ago, there was a lot of frustration across the U.S. with the amount of litter that we were seeing pile up. And there was a famous ad that was bankrolled by Coca-Cola and other big producers of disposable waste that was showing up everywhere, that sort of implored the average consumer to take responsibility and to recycle. And it's not as though that isn't a good impulse to have, but when that is put forward as the primary vehicle for accomplishing the task at hand of reducing the environmental impact that these enormous companies are having, it gives people a skewed sense of what the actual problem is. It gives people the sense that if they only consume enough, in the right kind of way, that the problem will go away. Likewise, I think it makes responding to these things seem rather elitist. It's usually more costly to do the right thing. And then, if you're a person who is just scraping by, as many millions of people in this country are, then it makes it seem like an elite concern, when in fact it really is not. And the real victims of what we are dealing with, and the people who are the most vulnerable to this, are those very people. So, I think it's important to be able to draw those connections. And I think generally, climate change is about, these vast complex systems that are all acting upon one another and are all, bearing down on people in different places in different ways, and affecting different systems that we've built human civilization around. And so it is critical, I think, then, to draw those connections to many different fields and many different areas of research to understand the full picture of what is actually happening.
Okay. And I thought that idea you said, this idea that, climate impacts all these different systems. And obviously, climate itself is made up of all these different sort of scientific systems. You have these systems that feed off of one another, these, vicious circles where different climatic and environmental factors reinforce one another. But you also mentioned that these are systems that human civilization has built up around. So it seems like you're saying climate is not just a systemic problem in the sense of these sort of scientific and environmental systems, but also in the way that it interacts with political and economic systems.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, thank you, Alex. We'll come back to you later in the show, but right now I want to go over to Dharna. Now, Dharna, you are a staff reporter at Gizmodo's Earther blog, right? And
Yeah.
I'm assuming that Earther, given the name, is about, I guess, the Earth, the environment.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Peter. So Earther is a blog based in Gizmodo, and we cover, the climate crisis, and then we also sort of broadly cover Earth systems. So that's also things like, biodiversity loss, which is not climate change, but obviously intimately related with climate change. And then we also try to really center people in those stories about Earth. So that's not to say that stories about polar bears or seals or birds are not important, and we do that too. But I think that fundamentally climate change is like often a climate story is a story about people who are responsible for it and people who are suffering because of it. And so we really try to bring that perspective to it, Arthur.
And I think that's such an important perspective and lens to have, because I feel like in the past, and maybe there's sort of a stereotype of climate reporting or environmental reporting as being primarily about like the environment itself. Like, you shouldn't litter, as Alex was saying, or you shouldn't, use fossil fuels because it hurts, quote unquote, the environment, meaning like animals and biodiversity.
Right.
And as Alex said, that can be seen as an elite concern if you're imagining that these are problems that affect an environment that doesn't have an impact on human lives. So this idea of centering the human impacts of climate change is so important. And I feel like it's a relatively new development in climate and environmental reporting. Do you think that's true, or is this something that kind of has always been done?
I mean, I think that there have always been folks who have done it, who have taken that like more, I guess, environmental justice approach, which I think is also just like what climate reporting should be a lot of the time. And I think that, I'm glad to see that more outlets are doing it. I'm saying this as someone who's like relatively new to the climate beat. But, I'm also really heartened to see that there's been a lot of focus not only on which communities are most impacted by climate change, which of course is like really important and we should always talk about that, but also who's responsible. So climate is a story about, people who are negatively affected by the, changes in the Earth's atmosphere and et cetera. But it's also a story about the people who are making decisions every day to like continue to extract oil and gas, or put up new plastics facilities, or build airplanes and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's really important to center people at every point, and not think of climate change as something that's like just kind of happening outside of us or whatever, but also as something that people are actively choosing to do.
So you said that you're relatively new to the climate beat. What is sort of your journalistic background? What were you doing before Earther?
So before I was at Earther, I worked for a long time at a small indie outlet in Baltimore where I live called the Real News Network. And I was a producer there. And I sort of covered all sorts of issues. Like I was a researcher and a producer on stories about war and like finance and labor and like gender disparity, all sorts of things. And I started realizing that like climate is something that obviously intersects with all of these issues. Like you talk about stories of war. Well, what's the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world? The Pentagon. Also the biggest contributor of greenhouse gases. Labor, like there's so many important stories of how unions are responding to closing oil plants and coal plants and natural gas plants and things like that, and such an important need to center the need for organized labor in the new green economy. And that just kind of went down the line with like every issue that I cared most deeply about. And so I don't know, maybe three-ish years ago, I kind of decided to make this central focus of my reporting. And I actually started largely by doing local stories that were sometimes not seen as climate stories. But for instance, I covered like the fight to not have a trash incinerator constructed in Baltimore, which was seen as like a sort of, oh, this is like a youth activism, like sort of fringe story. But that trash incinerator would have been the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the entire city. And I think from there, I sort of started to make these connections across my interests and found that all of them led me back to the same place.
Well, and I think that brings up an interesting point about the local versus national or international focus of climate reporting. There are certainly sites out there like Earther that are sort of focused primarily on climate or environmental reporting. And then you have national news organizations like HuffPost that might be able to have dedicated climate beat reporters. But what about local papers? Do most regional or local or metropolitan newspapers or news sites have dedicated climate reporters? And if not, how are they covering the climate crisis, and how could they do a better job of that?
I mean, increasingly more places are. And I kind of go back and forth on this. Like, on the one hand, I think it's really important to have journalists who are focused on the climate beat because it's such an important threat. It's like the existential threat of our lifetime. Not the only one, but I think the biggest one that humanity's ever faced. And you know, that's something that really deserves our attention. But on the other hand, again, like, the climate crisis is something that's so deeply entwined with every sort of beat in reporting. So, you know, I'd also love to see more sort of climate literacy and more of that sort of perspective come into lots of other different beats in journalism. And that's true, like, on the global and national level, and also on the local level. Not to say that, like, every single climate story or every single story has to say the word climate change or the words climate change in it, obviously. But you know, there's kind of always something there under the surface.
And do you think that how do you reach people who maybe don't, not so much they don't believe in climate change, because as Alex said, the debate is largely over, but people who don't necessarily see it as a major issue, as you said, you know, one of the biggest threats that humanity faces. I feel like by being at Earther, you're kind of preaching to the choir. I would imagine people who read a blog like Earther are already concerned, if not angry, about the climate crisis. So how would you reach people who maybe don't think about it on a day-to-day basis?
You'd actually be surprised, because Earther lives in Gizmodo. Lots of folks who read my blogs will email me and, like, you know, call me some earth-loving commie, which, like, whatever, that happens to be maybe the case, but, like, it's not the not essential to doing climate reporting. So there are definitely folks who are maybe not you know, not as interested or who are a bit more skeptical that the climate crisis is a human-caused problem. But in terms of reaching out to folks who may not be as primed to, you know, read a story that's focused on the climate crisis, I think that something that I try to do, and I know that Emily and Alex do as well, is really, again, center people's stories. It's a lot harder to think about, like, the like billions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions, or like you know, hundreds of barrels of oil. It's a lot harder to think about that scale than it is to think about, like, in this neighborhood, these folks are this much more likely to contract asthma or lung cancer, or, like, you know, in California, this is this particular neighborhood, whether it's Paradise or Malibu or whatever it is a neighborhood that didn't used to see wildfires, and now it sees wildfires, out of control wildfires. So I think that, you know, taking it to that smaller scale and then sort of building out from there, and remembering that though the impacts are really disparate and don't affect everyone equally, of course, they are being seen all over the world in different ways. So again, focusing on people, I think, really can bring people in.
I think it's interesting you talk about sort of the wildfires, you talk about the health disparities that can be linked to climate change, because I feel like a few years ago, there was a kind of debate or reluctance among journalists to directly connect those impacts to climate change, because there was no way of sort of saying this was directly caused by increased greenhouse gas emissions, even though there was a correlation there. Do you feel like that is something that journalists have gotten more comfortable with in sort of drawing those connections?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I definitely think that folks have gotten more comfortable. It's true, of course, that, like, it's very difficult to connect any one instance of a climate disaster to like global trends in temperature, changes in average temperature, things like that. But that doesn't mean that there's not clear evidence that instances of wildfires and severity of wildfires and droughts and hurricanes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, have increased with the global average temperature increasing. So I think that reluctance to make those connections is, I obviously, like, I'm not trying to say that I know like an individual fire was caused by this particular level of warming, because that would just be like bullshit. But I don't think that we need to shy away from pointing out trends. Like, people are able to see patterns when they're presented with scientific evidence, and I think that we should trust folks to be able to do that. So.
Now, what do you see as sort of the major climate stories of the next few years? I know you wrote this wonderful, very, very long piece about what the Biden administration might be able to do in terms of climate change. And it definitely seems like the tenor of climate reporting under a Biden administration would certainly be different than it's been under the Trump administration, where you're kind of just shouting into the wind and no one really cares. That's not to say necessarily that the Biden administration will necessarily act as much as it needs to on the climate crisis, but the relationship between sort of the climate press and people in power will be different. So what do you imagine is going to happen over the next 4 years?
Yeah, it's also a good question. And yeah, certainly like the tenor of the conversation is already very different. The relationship will certainly be different. But I guess a fear that I have in this sort of realm is that our perceptions have been so totally skewed by the past 4 years of Trump. We're so used to seeing just like rollback after rollback, so many assaults on regulations and environmental policy. And I get nervous sometimes that folks, myself included, will start to kind of ease up on holding Biden accountable to his own promises and judging the next administration based on the failures of the last one, rather than based on what's actually needed to tackle this crisis at the scale and magnitude that's needed. So in that giant piece that I wrote with Brian Kahn for Earther, we took a look at every agency in the executive branch to see what every single agency could sort of do to center climate policy and push it forward. So that's everything from like the Department of Homeland Security to the Department of Labor to more obvious ones too, like the EPA and the Department of Agriculture and things like that. And really found that if the next administration really wants to and chooses to, there's endless action that can be taken that often doesn't even really need the support of Congress. So if that's the bar that we're setting, if the bar that we're setting is like, take the most action possible and take this crisis as seriously as possible, I think the next 4 years might look a little different than if the bar is like where Trump has put it. So I'm excited to see how some of this shakes out, and also excited to dole out the praise where it's deserved, and also hold the next administration accountable where it may not live up to high expectations.
So it won't be enough to just get back into the Paris Accords.
No, it will not be enough to just get back into the Paris Accords. That would be, better than not being in the Paris Accord. But I think that, I think it's often sort of lost, maybe in part because of the rhetoric that comes from Trump and his administration, that the Paris Agreement is non-binding. It could certainly have impacts on our climate policy, could definitely push our climate policy forward, could change the way that we develop climate policy with other nations, for instance. But like the US has quite a bit of work to do besides joining the Paris Agreement. And, a lot of it needs to be done really, really quickly and can be.
Well, that I think is one thing that climate journalism generally emphasizes, that people outside climate journalism, including people in politics, don't necessarily realize, is like the timeline. It's not enough to just move in the right direction, but things need to be done within 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's kind of difficult to communicate that urgency sometimes, because it's like, how many different exclamation marks or like curse words or whatever can I use to convey this? And you know, it's dizzying sometimes. Like it's hard to sort of, take in the scale of a crisis that's completely unprecedented, as like the COVID-19 pandemic has also shown us. But yeah, I mean, the urgency is really real. There was just another report yesterday, or this morning, I guess it was released, from the United Nations, that said that if we don't make major changes, we could see 3 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century, which would be, a recent report said that 1.5 degrees was like an earth-shattering report from 2018 said that 1.5 degrees would be pretty catastrophic. And this is twice that level of warming. So yeah, it's high time that we get it together.
Although one thing I think that's interesting about, climate reporting in 2020, as opposed to say 2010, is that the time horizon has moved from the future to the present. Like, it always used to be, you were reporting on what scientists said, what the UN report said, that, oh, it will be very bad in, 50 years or even 20 years. And that is a very different kind of threat than talking about what is going on, what is happening on the ground right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a really important, way of sort of communicating the urgency, and also just like, frankly, a really important way of responding to the crises at hand, like each individual one and the global one. There's already this hurricane season was completely devastating. Again, this past wildfire season was completely devastating. Recent flooding in Bangladesh was just like horrific to see footage from. So yeah, I mean, I think it's also really important when judging climate policy in the future, particularly over the next 4 years, I think, that we keep that timeline in mind, because sometimes it's easy to praise actions that would have been maybe sufficient if they were taken 10 years ago. But the important thing is what needs to be done right now. So.
All right. Thank you, Dharna. Next, I'll be talking to Emily. And Emily, I feel like you are in a somewhat unique position, because you had a sort of staff job as a climate reporter, and then you left to start your own newsletter, in part because of the urgency of the crisis. Like it motivated you to, launch your own media organization, and speak in a more, I guess, angry tone about the climate crisis, if that's fair to say?
I mean, you could say it's angry. I would say that it's launching my own publication allowed me to cover the parts of the climate crisis that I consider the most important every day, which are inherently anger-inducing. I think that the climate beat is not really, in essence, a science beat. It's a beat about power and money and corruption and disinformation, and our ability as journalists to decipher the motives of sources, the motives of the most powerful, the responsibility, who's the most responsible and who's the least responsible for the greatest existential threat facing humanity and many ecosystems, and then also, an ultimate determination of whether or not you're able to do your job and as a journalist and print stuff that other people don't want published. That's what journalists are supposed to do. And I guess that definitely makes one, if you take that approach, definitely makes one feel angry, because there's a lot of messed up stuff going on. It's not just the ice caps are melting, it's people are profiting off the ice caps melting and deflecting responsibility for it.
So you really see the climate beat as almost a crusading investigative journalism beat. It
is that beat. And I think that it's way past time for our most aggressive, well-respected publications to start considering climate change as that story, and for the majority of people covering climate change to approach it in that way, because that is what the story is. It is the most important story that you could cover as a journalist, and I think it's the hardest story you can cover as a journalist, because it's the ultimate test of your ability to assess responsibility, to assess motive, and honestly to do what they teach you to do in journalism school, which is comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. There is nobody more comfortable than the people who are responsible for global warming, and there is nobody more afflicted than the people who will suffer because of it.
And so, specifically, when did you decide to start your own publication? How long had you been covering the climate beat?
I decided to do it last summer, so summer of 2019. Started Heated in September of 2019. And at that point, I had been covering climate change for almost 6 years. It's now been a little over 7. I started covering climate change in November of 2013.
And what was your original approach to covering climate change, and how did it shift over time?
I mean, I got into climate reporting because I wanted to be a political reporter, and I couldn't get a political reporting job. And I thought that covering climate change in DC would be a good way to get the kind of job I really wanted, which was some like hard-hitting political investigative job. And I considered climate reporting to be this like benign, like science environmental beat. And I probably covered it. I mean, I covered it sort of down the middle, really, for the majority of my career. And it took years. I mean, it took years it took getting off the beat, going into political reporting, covering the 2016 election, and then trying a bunch of different things before I realized that climate change was the political story that I was looking for the entire time. And so, you know, I certainly don't blame most of our highest media institutions for taking a while to realize it. I think that the disinformation machine, the climate change disinformation machine, backed by the fossil fuel industry, which funds disinformation on climate change for profit and to delay climate action, has been extremely sophisticated and effective in duping journalists into believing that they're good faith actors in this crisis. It has, you know, they mimicked the same tactics that the tobacco industry used for many years to effectively get reporters to, you know, both sides the issue of secondhand smoke for a long time. And but I do think that, you know, I'm not the first person to say any of this in any way, shape, or form. It's just that I've now realized that we have enough information to be far past the point that we are as journalists and as collective media to be still getting duped by powerful interests into not stating the facts as they are.
So do you feel that journalists are still being duped, particularly journalists on the climate beat? Or do you think that journalists on the climate beat generally, you know, have gotten better at calling out that disinformation
I think
and reporting on the scale of the crisis?
Journalists know. I mean, the reporters know. It's the editors at these top publications, at the Times, at the Post, who are still looking at climate change as this weird little niche story, and their beat reporters as sort of these, you know, sidelined issues. I mean, it's the ecosystem is getting better, but the people with the most power in media are frankly people who have been operating under the same norms of media for many, many years. That's how they got to those positions of power at our most respected media institutions in the first place. And it's why I started my own publication, because I realized that no matter where I went, you know, I was at the New Republic, which is a really well-respected news organization. And of course they allowed me to do, the reporting that I wanted, but I had to do it in the way that was, New Republic-y. And I realized that even if I had gotten offered a job at the New York Times, your dream job as a journalist, the job that you've always wanted since you were in school and you were 19 years old, that I wouldn't be able to do the type of reporting I wanted to do, that I would be pulled to this perspective that I don't think is appropriate anymore. There is a lot of proven corruption and profiting off of the destruction of the climate that I find objectively to be morally outrageous. And we still have not reached a point where our most mainstream media institutions think it's appropriate to have moral outrage over people who profit off of the expected deaths of millions of people. And I'm not willing to wait for them to come around, because the science tells us we do not have time for that.
And what exactly would you say is sort of the problem with a lot of, I guess, mainstream reporting, or at least framing, of the climate crisis? Is it being too deferential to bad actors who have an interest in stopping, progress on getting rid of fossil fuels? Is it an excessive focus on what individuals and individual companies can do, as opposed to calling for systemic political change?
For the most part, I really don't think the problem, again, is the individual journalists. I think all individual journalists working on this beat are doing generally a pretty great job. The problem is that for the scale of the crisis that we're facing, we have very few amount of journalists who focus on this crisis and who are well versed in it. I mean, I would say that I know personally pretty much every climate reporter working nationally, and that's ridiculous. Like, I shouldn't know all of them. And that has forced us into a situation where we have to prioritize what to cover in the biggest story in the world. I mean, that's wild. And then the difficulty of choosing what you're going to cover every day, when you have a deadline to hit every single day, when you have to write a certain number of stories every day, and it's impossible in our media ecosystem to adequately cover this story. The other thing I think is the problem is that, journalism is printing something that someone else doesn't want published, right? That's the famous George Orwell quote. And everything else is public relations. And I know that and think about that every day, and still I publish things that, aren't as, maybe they don't do that as much as something else that I could cover, right? There's always so many things for me to cover and choose and prioritize. What's the story I'm going to write today? And, what's the thing that I can write that powerful people don't want me to write? I mean, that's not generally the consensus of story prioritization that I think everyone is operating with on this beat. And, I fail in it all the time. And I think that we could all do better in our story choices. When we look at our full email inboxes of 200 press releases on 1 million reports, which one are we going to cover? Is it going to be the one that gets the most clicks, or is it going to be the one that makes Exxon most mad? I would say you should always choose the one that's going to make Exxon most mad.
But do you think that there is a place for sort of explanatory journalism, just sort of explaining what's going on with the climate? That's not necessarily like investigative journalism or journalism that upsets powerful people?
Yes, but I think at this point, the more important type of explanatory journalism for climate change is explanation of the history of climate politics and how we have historically dealt with climate change and issues like it, and the explanation of how disinformation works, the explanation of why you always hear a certain type of climate denial coming from a certain type of Republican, right? You know, explanation not only of why it's wrong to say there's so much uncertainty in the science, right? That's what a lot of climate deniers say, but explaining where that term comes from and why climate deniers use the word uncertainty to confuse. I think the most useful type of explanatory climate journalism is explaining how disinformation works, and explaining, you know, the history of fossil fuel company communications, the history of how they have funded think tanks and organizations that promote denial in order to delay climate action, stuff like that. I mean, of course, there's also a place for science reporting and explanatory science reporting, but I just don't think I think that's what a science reporter does, and I don't think that's what I personally think that climate reporting is not a science beat primarily. It can be if you're a climate science reporter, but if you're just a climate reporter, I think that involves so much more. That involves everything from politics to history to culture. I mean, climate change, we can get into this at another point, but like climate change is not just an emissions problem, it's a problem of who we are as people and what we value and what we hold dear to us. We're a culture of people who loves big trucks and big cars and rolling coal and drill baby drill. That's part of our identity. So, you know, there's so much more than science to explain about this problem. I just think that this whole beat demands creativity more than anything.
Okay. And I guess a similar question to what I asked Dharna, how do you think climate reporting will change during the Biden administration? Sorry, did you?
Sorry. Were you asking me or were you asking Dharna?
Oh, no, I was asking you. Yeah, I said.
Sorry.
Similar to what I asked Dharna, I want to hear from you. How do you think climate reporting will change during the Biden administration?
I think there will be more of it because we're going to have more climate focused things happening. You know, it's not just going to be stories about the Trump administration repealed this one thing again, and then another one, and then another one. You know, there are going to be a lot of actions to cover, and that's a lot more complicated and politically important than you know, inaction. So I'm thinking that because the Biden administration is staffing so many different parts of it, not just like the EPA, not just the Department of Energy, but, you know, Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, Budget Office, you know, with climate people, that's going to force political reporters and people on other beats to become experts in this kind of thing. And I think that's only going to benefit us. That's at least my hopeful take.
Yeah, I mean, the other possibility is that more people who are not well-versed in climate politics and climate science are going to be covering climate issues, and they're going to do a bad job where, you know, they might not communicate the urgency or the inadequacy of some of the actions the administration would take.
Yeah, and that's where media reporters come in, and that's where like you come in, and that's where people who have been established in this beat like Alex and Dharna come in. You know, part of our job over the next 4 years is not only going to be holding the administration accountable, but holding this new class of reporters accountable for covering this beat with integrity. That's that's right in the Society for Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, that's part of our job to ensure that our colleagues are also upholding these standards. And so I've always considered media criticism and accountability a huge part of my job as a climate reporter. And I think that will also be a big part of climate reporting for the next 4 years.
And if people want to, I guess, follow your work or subscribe to your newsletter, how can they do that?
They can do that. The URL is heated.world. So, heated like it's hot and world like the earth. And all my stuff is there, really. And then I'm on Twitter at Emorwee, which it's EMORWEE, which I'll put in the chat, I guess. Yeah, put it in the chat. I know how to do it.
I'll bring in everyone now. I want to have sort of a panel type discussion talking about, not only, I feel like you all have different sort of conceptions of what climate reporting is and sort of the different topics that are covered. And so I'm interested just, what does it mean to be a climate reporter, and what are the most important aspects of the climate beat to report on and to convey to the public? Because, Emily, I think you've, talked about how you think the focus should primarily be on the disinformation campaigns waged by the fossil fuel industry and its media and political supporters. Alex and Dharna, what do you think? Is it important to focus on the science, on the politics, on the business side?
I think all of the above, and basically none of them without the other. I totally agree with Emily that one of the most important things that we can do is really call out who the actors are who are responsible for global warming at every chance that we get. And I think that means that every science story is really a political story too. There's no way to really accurately and fairly report on something like a UN climate report or some paper that gets published in a scientific journal without indicating what the reasons are for the level of warming that we're seeing and for the increased levels of disaster and pain and suffering amongst human and non-human populations around the world. And similarly, I think that the science aspect is also really important in the political aspect. There's no way to accurately report again on a plan to bring a bunch of new power plants online, or bring on new petrochemical facilities, or build new highways or something like that, without really getting into the scientific and then human and health impacts of those decisions. And I think that not being versed at all in the science can lead folks to sort of make more have more vague ideas of what the issue is. And I think that for me, keeping the science in mind at all times has really helped me to, remember how urgent this crisis is. So yeah, all of the above and all of them together.
And
Alex, what do you think?
I think the two of them articulated very well things that I would think. What I would add to that is that I think we really desperately need to think about how to make a lot of these stories relevant to local readers and to illuminate the ways in which these policy issues and this corruption is happening on the local and the state level. I think in order to help people to understand what the federal policy response needs to be, or what the global policy response needs to be, which is certainly the scale at which we need to be thinking about this problem in a big way, is crucial, and connecting all those dots and telling that history of who has influenced policy until this point and who has failed to implement it until this point is critical. But I think that as we are seeing, the Biden administration actually finally take some steps to reduce emissions, we are going to see a lot of obstructionism recede to the state and even municipal level, and helping people to understand that and how that's happening in their backyard, funded by their utility and affecting their bills or their ability to, cheaply get an electric vehicle, cheaply or affordably, weatherize their homes and reduce their bills. Those are the things that I'm really interested in going forward, particularly as we're seeing millions of people potentially losing access to heating and electricity in the middle of the winter because they don't have a job and those bills haven't gone away, and those state and local governments have failed to actually provide them some kind of relief going forward in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, I'm interested in this idea of sort of making it relevant to different audiences. And similar to what I had asked Dharna earlier, how do you reach people who instinctively are distrustful of climate reporting? Maybe because, as Emily said, they have been fed a diet of propaganda. And so they don't actually know how serious the crisis is, or they're inclined not to believe it. That's for anyone. Just jump in.
I mean, I think that there's a problem of people not getting the right information that would matter to them. Alex spoke about people not getting information on a local level about why climate change might be relevant to them, or maybe not getting information about climate change that is put in terms that they care about. I mean, one of the things with coronavirus that we've seen is that there's a large chunk of the population who they want to hear things in terms of the economic impact and not terms of lives lost, and that's, for me, I think a life is probably the more important thing, and there is economic value to life. But at the same time, as reporters, we should be constantly communicating not just how much does a climate plan cost, how much will that cost a consumer, but how much will climate change unaddressed cost? How much will the lack of a plan cost? And the numbers that we have, the published economic literature we have about how much climate change will cost if unaddressed, are amazingly insane. I mean, just like absolutely crazy. Like, there's this one paper that published economic paper in like a very well-respected journal that says that climate change left unaddressed in the next over the next half a century will cost $500 billion. The world's $500 billion. That's like not even a number, and everyone's freaking out about Joe Biden's plan costing $2 trillion. It's just like, where is the, and then as a journalist, why are we not challenging politicians who complain about that cost with those numbers and just saying, how are you going to mitigate the economic impacts of climate change on your constituents? Because, and really figuring out and communicating to people the very real costs economically to their pockets of climate change and the potential benefits of putting clean energy stimulus, something like that, into policy. Like, I'm not saying that that's the thing that we have to do. I'm just saying that's the thing that we're not challenging people on and informing people on as journalists, that not just the economic costs, but the potential benefits that economic literature tells us about.
I would add to what Emily, pardon me.
No, go ahead, Alex.
I was just going to say that to add to what Emily's saying there, I think that there's a vital need to not only kind of flip the way that climate obstructionists talk about money, but also give readers some kind of economic history to understand how we got to this place in the first place. I have, throughout my career covering this, looked at climate change as an economic story. And part of that is the fact that we, and frankly, our parents' generation, are two generations of Americans who have lived under austerity politics for virtually our entire lives. You know, I mean, we are not familiar with a time when the government takes dramatic actions to improve the lives of ordinary Americans outside of, you know, affording, you know, long overdue rights or things like that. And so I think helping people to understand the fact that, you know, these radical interventions in the economy to prevent this catastrophic hellscape that is, you know, not even in the worst projections, you know, is even in the most moderate projections of what we may see by the middle of the century, you know, in order to help people understand how we deal with that, I think people need to get that, you know, we have lived under a, you know, particularly in the US, but at this point, a global regime of, you know, refusing to invest in things that are not, you know, generating profit immediately for large companies and that are costly and difficult to maintain for the government.
I totally agree, and I think that you know, in addition to what Alex just said, I think that there's been like a concerted effort by you know, fossil fuel companies, their allies in government, etc., other polluting companies, to make the climate story one of continued austerity. There's been a narrative for so long that the way that we address climate change is by taking things away from people. And yeah, like, we're going to have to lose some things, but we also have a lot to gain. I mean, it would be incredible for everyone to have access to, for instance, public transportation, or like an induction stove that works 100% of the time, or a weatherized home that allows them to pay, you know, less money on their utility bills every month. So reminding people that, like, yes, there's going to be a lot to lose, but for the most part, like, you know, many of us aren't going to be the ones who are losing the most. You know, the economic losses could potentially be economic gains for the majority of people. And frankly, like, I don't think that billionaires' money needs to be protected. I don't think that we need to be worrying about the profits of folks at Shell and Exxon, etc. We need to be worried about, you know, people's pockets and people's lives, more importantly.
So it seems like there's a problem in the way that a lot of people, not on the climate beat, talk about like political solutions to the climate crisis, where there's this kind of recency bias or presentist bias. And as you said, Emily, there's this idea that, you know, you want to talk about how much would a plan cost without considering that the path we're on is also going to be economically destructive. Like, there's this sense
already
that,
is very economically destructive.
Yeah, there's a sense that the status quo is acceptable, and so you need to justify any change to it as opposed to justifying the status quo itself. And I think this bleeds into the way that people talk about climate activism. You know, what, say, the Sunrise Movement is asking for is treated as politically extreme. It's not the bipartisan consensus. So do you have any advice for, I guess, political reporters on how to cover these issues better?
Start reading science. I don't really know. Like, like, start listening to people who understand climate change and not your 70-year-old editor. I honestly have no idea what to say other than maybe that your illusion of the status quo is false, because there is no status quo, because we are living in a fundamentally, constantly climate changed world. Every single year, like, one over the other is hotter than the next one. The economic damages that we're experiencing from that are getting bigger and bigger every single year. If you are very interested in maintaining the status quo, then you should be interested in learning more about climate policy, because without the status quo, it does not exist.
Alex or Donna, do you have thoughts?
I think that's right. I think it also helps to gain a deeper understanding of what the spectrum of climate solutionism actually does look like. You know, I mean, if you think the Green New Deal and the kinds of things that the Sunrise Movement and others of their ilk have proposed is radical, then my friend, I can't wait until you find out about degrowth. You know, there are similar, and I think that's very relevant because when we're talking about the passage of the original New Deal, a major factor that gave FDR the kind of leverage to do those things was that there was a vibrant and electorally viable in many places communist party at that time, and you had people that were acceding to the demands to expand the federal government in ways that it never had before, because the flip side of that is that there might actually be a revolution, and wealthy people and executives might find themselves up against a wall. So I think perhaps that reality won't become clear to people until there is like a really militant climate left that is proposing some actually radical approaches to this. The likelihood that will exist goes up every single year. It says, you have more and more people displaced, you have more and more billion-dollar disasters, and you have more and more desperate human beings that are asking, why the hell isn't the richest country in the world securing my basic right to water, shelter, and the ability to survive? So,
and why is Jeff Bezos so rich?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like why are all these people making money off of it? Also, like they're getting really rich.
Is the climate sort of crisis and talking about it honestly inextricable then from sort of a left economic politics? Can you believe billionaires should exist and also believe that the climate crisis needs to be solved, or does one necessarily follow from the other?
I think you can, but we just haven't heard it articulated because the right's main position is not staking out like a scientifically viable policy approach from that perspective. It's just leaning on denial of facts. I would love to hear that position, and I would love to cover that position, but we do not have that type of position. Yeah, I don't know.
Although is the right's position still based on denial of the existence of human-caused climate change? Because
yes.
I know, Alex, you were saying before, it feels like the debate has moved from a debate over whether climate change, whether human-caused climate change exists, to what are the necessary solutions to address it.
I think that is where things are moving. I think that denying the existence of climate change is becoming increasingly politically untenable. Now, is that still the vibrant and mainstream position within the Republican Party that Donald Trump is the leader of presently? Yes. Were you beginning to see the inklings of a right-wing response to climate change, acknowledging its reality, although perhaps not its severity, prior to the rise of Donald Trump? You were, and I think you're going to see that happen again now. I think it's important to kind of put denialism in and of itself in a box and then look at what comes beyond that. And I think what you're going to see from that is, both, folks on the right who say, yes, climate change is real, but the government is never a responsible or effective actor at dealing with things. So we just need the right market approaches and things like that. Similarly, I think there's even further right position than that, which is that climate change is real, and we need to protect our homeland for those of us who we deem acceptable to be here. And that is already forming. It's already taking root in Europe in a very serious way, and you're seeing the inklings of that here now. So I think that kind of climate fascism is something that we have to be very aware of and cognizant of the fact that it is emerging. Now, on that market position, is that a real position? Is that denialism? To that, I will say that in 2018, when the IPCC report came out, I asked the authors that very thing. Is there a pathway to 2 degrees of warming with market solutions alone? And prior to answering, a couple of them discussed on the panel, and then they started to laugh. and quickly said no. And I think that answers that question better than anything I can say.
Oh, and if anyone could just always ask questions like that, like that's such a great question to ask those people.
Totally. And I think that, that like 2018 paper that was like so groundbreaking and I think really was what woke so many folks up, made it clear that, if by a left economic position, you mean massive public investment and you mean like massive changes to, our entire global economy, like that is what, there's no question, like there's no real debate that, yes, that those things will be necessary. You can debate like, lots of what the role of nuclear is, or like what the role of, the public sector is in terms of like taking over the fossil fuel industry, or the role of things like geoengineering, or carbon capture, things like this. You can debate the sort of particular solutions. But if climate scientists, like the world's leading climate scientists, are starting to sound like radicals in that way and making it very clear that we need unprecedented levels of economic change, then I think that pretty much answers the question.
I mean, it seems like, if you move away from this outright denialism of the science, there is an emerging position on the right, it feels to me, and I don't know how you would feel about this, that is almost like with the, COVID lockdowns, where even if people don't deny like that COVID is real, they still say, it's worse to shut down the economy. So even if they're not denying the existence of climate change, I feel like conservatives are moving to this position where it's like, climate change is real, but it's not bad enough, or it would be worse if we shut down the economy and put all these people out of work.
Just wait till what it looks like in 10 years, dude. It's gonna look way worse than the pandemic. I mean, it's going to be much harder to have the positions you see now as this gets worse and worse. And that's, that probably sounds very alarmist because, and like, well, okay, but it is. I mean, our models have been largely correct so far. There's no reason to think they're going to continue. They're not going to continue being correct. And I think part of being a responsible reporter on this beat is communicating very uncomfortable truths to people who do not want to hear it. And one of those truths is that it's going to get so much worse. If you think that the wildfires in California are bad now, if you think the hurricanes in the Gulf Coast are bad now, if you think droughts are bad now, if you think sea level rise bad now, if you think the fishing economy is bad now, I mean, get ready. Get ready. That's the responsible truth.
Well, and not only are things going to get worse in terms of like the climate itself, but I think also in terms of the responses to it. As Alex was saying, you might see a more militant climate left, or what I think is much more likely, a militant climate right. And, this sort of eco-fascist or climate apartheid stuff where, like, everyone is very happy that the Biden administration is taking climate seriously. But like, if the US government is taking climate seriously, that doesn't necessarily mean mitigating it. Like, as you said, Dharna, the major user and emitter of fossil fuels is the US military. And climate change affects things like geopolitics and regional wars. So I don't know if the U.S. taking climate change seriously is necessarily a good thing. Like if you have a climate envoy on the National Security Committee, does that mean that we are going to take radical action to arrest climate change, or does it mean that we are going to like militarize it and protect our geopolitical strategic interests?
Yeah, I also worry about this, particularly because, the Pentagon, in addition to being so much better funded than like every other agency, has relatively little oversight. So yeah, I mean, I think I also am concerned that merely taking the climate crisis seriously is not necessarily going to bring forth the kinds of solutions that I think could benefit the majority of people, which is obviously not to say that like taking the climate crisis seriously is not important. But I think that, like, I think that part of the reason that that sort of like national security and sort of like we just need to protect the homeland kind of thinking is so dangerous is not only because it's going to be so horrible for people in other places, but also because like it's not so like right now it's very easy, I think, for folks kind of broadly on the right to look at the global south, for instance, and say like, well, of course this is happening to those poor brown people over there. But I think, as time goes on, it's not like these disasters are going to be so clustered. Like many parts of the world are going to be hit in many different ways, and already are now. So it's not only horrible and unethical because of the impacts for others. It's also going to be pretty horrible for folks here in the U.S.
Absolutely. Now, Emily, I know you need to get going soon, so I just want to give you sort of a last chance to both say, what would you say to reporters on other beats, especially political reporters, about the climate crisis? And what do you want normal people, non-journalists, to know about the climate crisis? Like you were talking before about the importance of, telling these uncomfortable truths to people who might not want to hear them. What do you wish that most people, like everyone who's watching this now, knew about the climate crisis?
Thank you for asking the political reporter question again, because the first time I answered it, I was like, I don't know, tell them to read something. But I realized I had a better answer, which is that, I wanted to be a political reporter ever since I learned what a political reporter did and what it was. And it's because political reporting is sexy. It's a sexy profession. You get to talk about, cover corruption and profit and power and misinformation and all this kind of stuff. And that's what climate change is if you cover it that way. And if you're having trouble finding good corruption, power, money stories on the politics beat, please come to climate politics reporting, because we have so many that we do not have enough people to cover. If you're a young journalist looking for an opportunity to start uncovering stories and breaking stories, look at climate change, look at climate power and corruption and money. There are so many avenues for you to get in this and start making a name for yourself and do important reporting that exposes the powerful, comforts the afflicted, inflicts the comfortable. This is not just an important story, it's a sexy story. And it's a story that any journalist who has that like journalistic drive, once they've realized that, like everyone should want to be a climate journalist, I think. And then for regular people, I would just say, if you feel sad about climate change, if you feel powerless about climate change, you feel like there's nothing that you can do about climate change, which is what a lot of people feel, that's what the fossil fuel industry paid for, and that's how they want you to feel. And the more you feel powerless, the more you replace your powerlessness with anger, that's what they don't want, because they want you to be sitting there complacent, saying there's nothing I can do, so I'm just going to let the world burn. And that's great for their pocketbooks, because that means that they are not being pressured to not only pay up for the years of knowing disinformation that they sowed about climate change in order to profit, but they don't have to speed up their transition to a clean energy economy now. So, the plastic stuff that Alex was talking about earlier, how they created campaigns for individual responsibility so that society would shift the blame onto us rather than them. Think of that every time you think about how sad you are about climate change. And maybe you'll, because it's a little more fun to be mad, maybe you'll feel a little better, and maybe you'll troll Exxon on Twitter a little more, and that'll make.
Well, yeah, I think people should check out your newsletter, Heated. I love the tagline that it is for people who are pissed off about the climate crisis.
Yeah, could you tell?
What?
So could you tell that I'm pissed off about it? I guess I am.
Yeah, I can. You're very angry, and in a good way. All right, Emily, we will let you get going. Just a few more questions for Dharna and Alex before we wrap up. So one thing that sort of, I guess, concerns me, sort of continuing off what we were talking about before, is what kind of solutions well, first of all, whether climate reporters should do solution journalism at all and like lay out what the solutions are to the climate crisis, and then how they make sure that those solutions are not either, PR fluff pieces about like what individual corporations or philanthropists are doing, and also make sure that, they don't just call for immediate serious action without considering maybe the equity and justice of those actions. Because again, there are ways that the US government can take the climate crisis seriously that are not good for a lot of people around the world. So do either of you have thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, in terms of whether or not climate journalists should be solutions journalists, I mean, I guess, like, sure, it depends on what you mean, I guess. I think, of course, there are many solutions, both ones that currently exist that could be sort of replicated and scaled up, and ones that, we sort of have the research for, or that folks are starting to think about that we could enact. But I guess, first of all, I don't think that solutions journalism needs to pretend that there's a single solution to everything, that there's like some silver bullet, that if we just do this, if we just like spray something into the atmosphere to block out the sun's rays, or if we just put the carbon tax in place, then everything's fixed. I think that solutions journalism can be full of nuance and really take the scale and urgency of the crisis seriously. And then I guess I'd also say that, when reporting on solutions, keep the science in mind. And as you're saying also, Peter, like keep who's going to benefit in mind too. It's very easy, I think, to get caught up in like solutions because they sound like they're going to work. And some of the time they may, and it's some of the time they won't, and some of the ones that won't work and won't meet the requirements that the science has laid out are the ones that are getting lots of investments, and they're the ones that tons of governments and corporations around the world are really pushing for. See like any UN climate international meeting. So yeah, sure. Like, yes, we should all be reporting on solutions. I think that that's great. Just we should do so realistically.
And how do you, sorry, Alex, you can address that, but also how do you keep sort of the idea of climate justice or environmental justice part of your work as a climate reporter?
Well, I think it's easier now than ever before in the sense that there is a really well-organized infrastructure of people who are politically fighting for that kind of climate justice. I think we're also, living through this really overdue and fascinating political uprising over racism and discrimination in this country, and I think that has offered ample opportunities to see many of the ways in which the communities who have borne the brunt of pollution historically are also the ones that are in need of the most vibrant and well-funded government response. So I think building sources in those areas, bringing some of those folks in to actually comment on stories that may not be specific to their community itself, and putting them front and center is really vital to doing that. In terms of how that applies to solutions, I mean, I'm quite open-minded to any of the things that we can do to decarbonize at the rate that we need to. I am, there are many in the climate world who subscribe to certain orthodoxies about what is the most appropriate approach. All renewables, should nuclear be in the mix? Is carbon capture appropriate, and where? Are slightly more frightening and radical interventions like geoengineering something that will need to be considered, and how and what should be done about that? Those are all really fascinating questions, and ones in particular where the question of what will the impact on warming of this be, and what will the impact on communities that have already suffered disease and poverty as a result of their proximity to pollution? How will it affect them? So I think there are a lot of areas to examine these things in an honest and nuanced way that I think makes this job really interesting.
So I think second to last question here is, are you concerned about allegations of bias if you are, reporting on climate in a way that certainly is not deferential to one of the two main political parties in the US or to the fossil fuel industry? If you're actually working with or talking to people who have been impacted by the climate crisis, or climate activists, I mean, do you worry that people will just dismiss you out of hand, or say that you're doing activism instead of journalism?
Am I? Sorry, go ahead, Alex.
No, you take this one first. I was just talking.
Am I concerned about it? I mean, in terms of like my employer, I'm pretty lucky to work at an organization that doesn't have any sort of illusions about needing to not be biased or to take an objective position. I think I make it pretty clear in my writing every day that like I have particular interests and beliefs, and we are kind of able to express those freely, which is cool and pretty different from other cool and important reporting. But I mean, I do I guess think that it's important, and sort of am sort of constantly checking to make sure that I am critically reporting on the activism and the advocacy that is so crucial. Yes, I obviously think that there is an urgency to take on the climate crisis, and that we need a mass movement to push civic leaders, etc., to sort of bring that forth. But there have been many instances where climate organizations who operate with those principles have done things that I would not consider to be on the path of doing that in a way that's just and fair and honestly scientific. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's really no friends or enemies or anything. It's just, will this thing work? What is your perspective on this thing? And if it makes me biased to say that I think that it is good that there are activists who are fighting to end the greatest threat to humanity in the world, then so be it. I guess then I'm biased, but that doesn't mean that I think that we can report on anyone uncritically, I guess.
I think that was well said, and I would add to that something I guess a little bit self-reflective. I am sure that at various points in my reporting, I have failed to generously characterize positions that would objectively lead to insufficient outcomes. If the desired outcome, as I would think any human being living on this earth would want, is a livable planet with systems that can support the civilization that we've built over the last 20,000 years. Perhaps in being biased toward that, I think that is true. I do think that there is important work that can be done in analyzing different people's motivations for holding certain beliefs. I do think, I think we were, as we were discussing earlier, there's often this dichotomy that is drawn between deaths and cost. And certainly from some of the biggest level actors who contribute to climate denialism or try to block these things, that cost issue can be very disingenuous. I don't think that's true for everyone. For a long time, climate policy and climate response was really couched in carbon pricing, and that was widely considered, the most comprehensive way to deal with this. I mean, credit to those who brought forward the kind of Green New Deal as an alternative to that. But we have seen where those types of pricing schemes can be really hurtful to people. I mean, the Yellow Vest protests in France, which proliferated for a number of different reasons that are nuanced and specific to there, were ultimately coming from an increase in the price of gas. And so I think it's really important to consider how the outcome of a certain climate policy may be ultimately positive for emissions and quite regressive and harmful for people that it may affect. And I think you have to be considerate of that, and I think that we should reflect that in our reporting. And that's something that I challenge myself to do. Likewise, I think there are people whose work I admire and who have done fantastic work in shifting the way that we talk about these things. I brought up the Green New Deal activists earlier, but you also can speak to a lot of climate experts who will say that there are many people in that realm of climate progressivism who write off nuclear energy or write off carbon capture technology whole cloth. And, you'll speak to other experts who say that is in itself, denying some of the realities of how quickly we need to decarbonize and what a mammoth task it will be just to hit, our least ambitious goals. So, I think that there are a lot of ways to be fair and critical all around, and to be thoughtful in the way that we characterize why people believe certain things without being deferential to a scientifically unsound position that was quite literally fabricated by corporate propagandists to misdirect people by abusing the institution of journalistic objectivity as it existed at that time. So, are people going to accuse me of being biased? Perhaps. Do I have a bias like anybody? Of course, but I think interrogating these things in that way and considering the different motives that people have and, considering the nuances of how this may play out is critical to pushing back against that and hopefully earning the trust of the readers who are consuming what we write.
And unfortunately, Emily is no longer here, so I guess we'll never know how she feels about being accused by the right wing of being biased. Great show, guys. I just have one final question, and then I'll let you go. And that is the same question that I asked Emily before she left, which is, I guess, a two-parter. First of all, what do you believe it's important for journalists on other beats to know about the climate crisis? And secondly, what would you say to normal people, non-journalists? What do you wish that they knew? What do you want to tell them about, the climate crisis and what you do as a climate reporter?
Maybe I'll take the second part of that first. I think something that I've found really useful in this sort of world is reminding folks that oftentimes like the horrible like mess that we're seeing around us isn't our fault. And I think that reminding people like, hey, everything is crumbling around you, and you know, without some huge actions, it's going to get worse. But that's not your fault. That's not because you bought plastic bottles or because you have a car. You know, I'm sure that if like Coca-Cola and Pepsi or whatever like transitioned to a reusable model, or if we all had public transportation and all vehicles were electric, like I'm sure that you would not oftentimes refuse to make that transition. You know, like these are norms that are so much bigger than any one individual person. And does that mean that individual actions are completely unimportant, or that there's nothing that individuals can do? Of course not. Like I think that everyone should try to do whatever it is that they can, including like demand more from the people who bear the biggest responsibility. But you know, I think that I've found that for kind of obvious reasons, everyone, like myself included, gets pretty turned off by being told that the biggest thing that they need to do to solve a global problem is to make changes themselves. So yeah, I don't know. I telling folks that it's not their fault seems to be one thing that I guess quote unquote normal people could take away.
And do you have any thoughts on what to say to other journalists?
Sure. I mean, I guess that I really believe that there are climate stories in every beat, the same way that there are lots of other like sort of topical stories to be told within the climate beat. And I guess that I get really excited to see journalists who aren't particularly climate journalists, to see those folks not shy away from that. So, you know, in like stories about culture and stories about like food and, you know, fashion and things like that, I get really, really stoked to see folks talking about the climate and environmental justice impacts of all different kinds of industries. And I think that more of that would be really awesome. So I guess just having an open mind to, you know, to seeing the climate as the context for everything, which I guess is also what the word climate means in another sense, can really push all kinds of journalism forward. And, you know, I also take so much from folks who are on other beats completely in my reporting all the time. So I hope that that's something that other journalists can find useful too.
All right. Thank you so much, Dharna. Alex, what do you think?
Well, in terms of the advice that I would offer to my fellow journalists, you know, I guess I would start from an analogy that I used to think about where we are at. You know, I have had many people in my close life who have struggled with addiction, and I think you know, there are a lot of valuable lessons from that struggle, both around shame and guilt, about denialism, and about the kind of spiritual emptiness that can lead one to, you know, refusing to take action about the disaster that is happening right in front of them. You know, I think that there's also an important lesson in dealing with addiction, where, you know, I think many people who have overcome it and gone into recovery are you know, people who have done it with the help of others and with groups. You know, it's not usually something that you can successfully white knuckle and succeed at overcoming alone. And so I think understanding that kind of framing is really important for what I'm going to say next, which is that, you know, for reporters that are not on this beat, you know, I would urge them, you know, unless they really have a firm understanding of the science and can paint a clear picture of what is going on, to, you know, really back away from some of the apocalypse rhetoric that I have seen come up in recent years. You know, I understand why that is. I would argue that some of the Mad Max scenarios that people sometimes fear we are headed toward in the United States are things that are already happening in water-starved parts of the world where there is already brutal conflict, like in a place like Yemen. And so I think, moving away from that and using some kind of rhetoric that both captures the scale of what's happening, the magnitude of the change that is required to avert it, but still provides people some hope and some understanding that the world isn't going to end in 10 years. It's just going to really suck, and a lot of people are going to suffer. And I would urge people to think like that, and I would urge regular readers to understand that as well. That there is no deadline that we miss and then it's all over. So we ought to just live our lives with no with no direction and live these hedonistic existences. I mean, perhaps is what you'd like to do, and that's your prerogative. But I think that this is a moment when we need to be, coming together and restoring some sense of community in order to deal with the things that are happening. And I think this is a moment when, no matter what happens, we are going to have to deal with this, and it can always get worse. It can always get worse. So I think, at losing hope is the absolute worst thing that you can do.
Well, yeah, and as Emily said before she left, losing hope is what the sort of fossil fuel supporters and propagandists want you to do. They're interested in you having that nihilistic attitude instead of getting angry and trying to work to make a better world. So, Alex, Dharna, I want to thank you for coming on the show. I'm sorry we went way over time. I also want to thank Emily for coming on. You should definitely follow Emily, Alex, and Dharna on Twitter and subscribe to Emily's newsletter, Heated, at heated.world. That's all the time we have tonight. Thank you so much for watching Stern Look on HAPS. If you like the show, I would strongly encourage you to join HAPS. Don't worry, it's free, and subscribe directly to Stern Look. If you have any questions or suggestions of topics I should cover on the show, feel free to email me at sternlook@gmail.com. See you next week. Okay, and we're clear.